The growth of investors in Atlanta is all over recent real estate analysis on YouTube and podcasts.
You remember Occupy Wall Street? Well,
The growth of investors in Atlanta is all over recent real estate analysis on YouTube and podcasts.
you remember Occupy Wall Street? Well, Wall Street's occupying real estate right now, especially in Atlanta.
We're now the #1 market for investors buying homes.
Studies by housing sites.
I don't think you can see it.
Yes, I can hear it. All right, do this.
All right, great.
Us here live, those who are joining via radio, social media, and ultimately TV. We are excited to be hosting today's event with, as you will hear, our nonprofit leaders and our mayors focus on affordable housing in our region. And we're excited to be hosting this in partnership with WABE because affordable housing is a foundational pillar of our new strategic plan, Together ATL. Together ATL, for us, is grounded in our commitment and our invitation to all of you to help build a more equitable and prosperous place for all, not just some, but for all who call our region home. Affordable housing is central to that because not only does it provide a safe place for folks to call home, but it also serves as a hub for opportunity. It shapes significantly what kinds of jobs we have access to, where our kids go to school, how safe we feel walking down the street. All these foundational things that really help determine whether any of us have a fair shot at a decent life. This issue is also really important because it underscores in its breadth and scale, this affordability challenge, why it is so important that all of us, the public sector, the private sector, foundations, nonprofits, come together, because it is only in coming together that we have a shot at addressing the significant challenges. Because these challenges, as we will hear from the panel over the next hour, are not insignificant. Today in our region, the median home sales price exceeds $370,000. Single-family development today is at its lowest level in 6 decades. And in the city of Atlanta alone, we are losing more than 1,500 units of affordable rental housing annually, and it's getting worse. And you couple those stark facts with the projections that our friends at ARC have shared that over 90% of our region's growth over the next 20 to 30 years will come from BIPOC households. We run the risk of perpetuating and widening the racial disparities we know already exist in our community. It is a lot. But we're not here today just to talk about the challenges. We're here to talk about solutions. Today is about action. Today is about leadership. Today is about when all these folks here will tell you about how coming together we can actually make a dent and really start moving the needle on issues of affordability, because it is fundamental to our community. So I'm excited to hear from them all the wonderful things they're doing, and I hope you will be as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the incomparable host, Ms. Rose Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank, and good morning. As he said, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be a part of this very important conversation. We know that it's not just a national conversation, okay? We know that it's a conversation that needs to be had regarding every tentacle of life, from healthcare, housing, mobility and transit, workforce development, education. All of those tentacles, they intersect. So if there's a crisis in one area, that means it's affecting all the others, as Frank alluded to. And so hopefully today, and I told the panel backstage, we won't be able to figure it all out in 51 minutes, although I think Mayor Dickens thinks he can. I'm gonna hold him to that. But we hope that what you take away from this is that it does take a public-private community partnership. And folks will say, well, as a journalist, are you supposed to say that? Absolutely, I'm supposed to say that, because not one entity can help solve this problem. So we hope that you all, that will be the takeaway. And then after I ask all the questions, then y'all go out and figure it out. And if you want to get a snapshot of one of the issues that we're having when it comes to the affordable housing crisis here in the Atlanta region, my colleague Stephanie Stokes, who's been doing a wonderful job covering the housing issues, she has been hitting all these particular little metrics that add to the issues. And we're going to take a listen and see a clip right now.
The growth of investors in Atlanta is all over recent real estate analysis on YouTube and podcasts.
You remember Occupy Wall Street? Well, Wall Street's occupying real estate right now, especially in Atlanta.
We're now the #1 market for investors buying homes.
Studies by housing sites Redfin and CoreLogic estimate 30 to 40% of Atlanta home sales were to investors. That's over 2 different periods last year. David Howard represents some of those investors, the ones who rent out single-family homes. He runs the National Rental Home Council. He says in Atlanta, investors are following people.
Atlanta has had tremendous in-migration over the past 2, 4, 5 years, tremendous job growth. It's an expanding market.
That all leads to a demand for housing. Howard says investors buying single-family homes, some of whom are big companies, are just providing options.
We're going to make homes accessible in those neighborhoods where people want to live.
But in a tight housing market, investors could reduce options for some Atlanta residents. That worries Karen Hatcher, president of the Atlanta Realtors Association.
It's tough if you're on the lower income side of the bracket.
Throughout the pandemic, few homes have been for sale. In the last year, prices rose 20%. And buyers have to compete with investors who can make cash offers and waive inspections.
We just want to make sure that we are ensuring that there is a healthy housing environment where everyone can participate.
Which includes investors. Stephanie Stokes, WABE News.
Mayor Dickens, I'll start with you, that the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank said the housing market, Atlanta's housing market is unaffordable. Are we at a point now where are we too far behind that we can't reverse this and we can just do what we can? Or are we in a sense where this region can come together and really make an impact and provide some affordable housing or renting units to our residents?
Yeah, Rose. So it's close. And, the optimist in me says that we can reverse the tide with a lot of hard work and significant consideration as a region. This is a regional issue. I share the same concerns that I'm seeing other colleagues around the metro experience. In 2013, when I was running for city council, I was talking about affordable housing, and there were communities in Atlanta that were saying, we don't want no more affordable housing. This is too much affordable housing down here on the south side and the west side. And I was saying that train is headed your way. Just know that in a little while, this is also going to be unaffordable. And so I was talking about inclusionary zoning and those things, finally got that passed. And now you see the benefits of that along the Beltline. Not nearly enough, but you also see that everything that's going up, at least 10 to 15% of it is set aside for affordable housing. So when you see, Decatur adopt that policy and some other northern suburbs, Doraville and others adopt this policy, it's not they're adopting it because they like nice policies. They're adopting it out of necessity. When in 2013, 14, and 15, they didn't know that this was very real. But if you look at any trend line from back then, you see that this was happening. The cost of housing has increased by 65% since 2010. So that meant if you were paying $1,000 for rent in 2010, you're now paying $1,650. If you're paying, $1,500, now you're well into the high 2000s since 2010. But the challenge is people's incomes, working folks' incomes have not increased by 65%. Mm-hmm. So it's affordable housing. The housing part is where we're trying to do the construction and do the policy making and do all those things. But the affordable part is also about incomes. Mm-hmm. It's about a state that has a $5.15 minimum wage, where I took the city to $15 an hour minimum wage in 2017, 2018. That's not even enough now. Mm-hmm. You can't afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Metro Atlanta for under $19 an hour now is about what you need to have a 2-bedroom. So what I'm saying is we have to immediately begin to look at ourselves as behind, but we have to catapult like very, very far ahead, because it's happening, and it's at least our eyes are open to it in areas where people initially did not see that this was going to be a problem. Now it's a problem metro-wide, and I would say nationwide.
Mayor Steele, what about you? How far back are we, and can we catch up?
I think we can. Lawrenceville is unique. We're the second oldest city. We're 200 years in the metro area, so we're over 200 years old. So we have a lot of old inventory. So we have actually had a lot of affordable housing in that inventory, but unfortunately, it was not quality inventory. And that's what we're really seeing is how do we build up the housing so people can live in something that's quality. But we also just the previous council and this council also agrees with it. We just created 300 units, I guess 240. We did this with the Lawrenceville Housing Authority that Lejla's in charge of. So we increased 240 units of affordable housing. A portion, just a small portion, will be market rate, but everything else is on a sliding scale. So the 2 bedrooms will be going from $700 to $1,200 in cost, and we just broke ground for that. We started this in 2019, so it just seems to take forever to get something through. But the Lawrenceville Housing Authority worked in conjunction with One Street Residential, and so we have one section that will be, or one development will be for seniors, and others will be just multifamily. But that's just finally broke ground 2 weeks ago on that.
Yeah. Jim?
Yeah, I think that that we're talking about complexity, right? And when we start talking about housing and we get into the real estate portion, the acquiring and the assembly of real estate, and then the construction, and we start putting together financial stacks to do that, we naturally try to figure out what's the algorithm to solve the problem. I don't know how many of you feel like your lives have been bettered by algorithms, but this is a human problem, and problem, not the right word for that, but we need solutions that have a human point of view in them, not just an algorithm. And that is going to take political will. It's going to take people moving with and utilizing the market, but also being willing to move against the market on some things. When we start talking about just bottom line, return on investment, that kind of thing, those are, I would say, behind the scenes, that human piece is what has to drive our decision making. And unfortunately, sometimes we're letting algorithms drive those decisions. So can we change trajectory? I think we can. I think one of the things also in this that I'm in downtown Atlanta, so that is impacting our region is we have the benefit of some extremely large organizations coming, and the Googles, the Amazons, the Microsoft, these. I have a good friend that calls them. They have the economics of nation states, and we can look across the U.S. and see the impact of these businesses. We want their economics, we want the jobs, we want the benefits that they bring, but we also see what it means for housing in the areas where those are. And so I think there's multiple decisions going on at the same point that are impacting housing. And so you wonder how long it is that median income and below can live within the Beltline. I think we have to move decisively, and we have to think with humanity behind it, and not trust that the algorithm is going to produce what we want, the outcome we want 10 years from now or 15 years from now.
Lejla?
I always caution against using such or phrasing these problems in catastrophic terms, as if, there is no going back. This is so complex that it cannot be solved. It's not true. It is, reaching crisis levels. But, for us to say, this is just becoming too much of a problem, it gives us a pass to throw our hands in the air and say there's not much we can do, when in reality we can. Our nonprofit covers the entire jurisdiction of Gwinnett County. We're the development arm of the Lawrenceville Housing Authority. And, we have just in the last 2 years, quadrupled our output. We're still just scratching the surface, but we really are ramping up production of affordable housing. And what is needed, to me, there are tools, there's financing. We need the political will and a sense of urgency on the part of our elected officials, the nonprofits, and the philanthropy to realize we have tools, we just have to act now. Speaking about the housing market, for example, in Gwinnett County, suburban counties often get overshadowed. Usually the focus is in Atlanta. And, one of the interesting facts, for example, is that the median sales price in Gwinnett County, based on the FMLS data, just exceeded $400,000 in March of this year. That went up from $245,000 in 2019. And, this is supposed to be a bedroom community. It's supposed to be the more affordable option to Atlanta, but it is not. So, and with the activity of the institutional investors, we're really seeing less and less opportunities for that intergenerational wealth being that home ownership allows families. So yes, it is a problem. It is approaching crisis level, but there's absolutely things we can do right now to help get ahead of it.
So Lejla, let me start with you with this next question, because all you're saying, again, it's going to take a holistic approach. So if we work from the top down or from the outside in, let's start at the federal level. Is this something that then policy and legislation, you start there? And if that is the case, what does that, through your lens, what is that piece of legislation or policy that has to be implemented at a federal level before we bring it to state and local? Lejla, I'll start with you.
I think all of the affordable housing development is relies on public-private partnerships. And some of the regulatory burden that comes with the federal money makes it, we sometimes struggle to attract developers to work on our projects, even when we have financing, because of just the regulatory burdens that they have to comply with. It's a steep learning curve for them. Again, this is where the nonprofits really, we have to be adaptable. We have to adapt to the changing markets. We completely reworked our approach to affordable housing development from acquisition of single-family homes into construction on a larger scale. But one thing that we have done to respond to the lack of interest from the private sector to work on our programs, we're creating a pool of contractors right now who we are going to train on Davis-Bacon wages, Section 3 compliance, and all of these federal programs and the strings that come attached with the federal money, so that we can utilize the tremendous amount of money that is coming down through the American Rescue Plan Act and the CARES Act funding. But overall, that's a big job for a small nonprofit to take. So overall, at the federal level, I think if we can remove some of the regulatory barriers and to make it more conducive for the private sector to engage in the development, it would go a long way.
Jim.
Yeah, I would say similar, that the federal level is not my expertise, but for federal dollars, we use the compliance requirements for a small nonprofit are fairly complex, and those could be eased. I would say, I know it's not a perfect program, but the low-income housing tax credit program has been extremely successful at producing units, and it's not an easy system and not a perfect system, but it works for producing units. And at some level, we do need to produce more units. And so that's a program that I would support expanding.
Mm-hmm. Mayor Steele?
We have a fairly large undocumented population, and they're being taken advantage of, having to live in the cash world and, don't have driver's license and things of that nature. At a federal level, if we could get, foreign workers program of some sort going, so that then they can move out of that and get their driver's license, not have to drive to Maryland to get a driver's license and work here in the state of Georgia. So that would be a huge help to us, because right now, for instance, with programs Lejla is doing, anything that has HUD money attached to it, they can't be used. They can't use that program. So we have to rely on our nonprofits to come together. That's what I was talking to Jim about, what he's doing, because we're trying to do that in Lawrenceville, is bring our nonprofits together to build some quality housing for that population that we have, so that they can live in quality housing. Because right now we have trailer parks where they're paying $500, for a 1950s trailer, and they have to own it. And then they pay them $400 for utilities, and they're living in not really good conditions. And they're not going to complain, because they're very fearful of the government. So that would be, from a federal level, something major we need.
Is that not something you, as the mayor and the city council, you all can enact any ordinances against those property owners or landlords, if they're taking advantage of this population?
Well, real estate rights are really interesting. So we work, and it favors the property owner. So once you're grandfathered in, and this has been occurring, now we can, on the back end, we can do things when somebody's new coming into a new product. But this is property that's been done that way since 1950. So we're working with the nonprofits to try to, and then find the leaders in those communities, for instance, so that then they can assist with the construction and everything, and then have higher paying jobs. And that's one thing Lejla and I were talking about just this past week, is that's one of our key things, is the higher paying jobs, because obviously the housing is just continuing to go up. And so we've got to find a way. We're limited because we're such a small geographic city. So we have to rely on, like, Partnership Gwinnett to help bring jobs, and because they're our arm, our economic development arm, if you want to say. So that's one of our key things. And then having that last mile transportation is another thing that we're looking at. Our council is, because we need that because we have some of our young students that will do internships, and more than a third of their hourly rate goes to Uber. So,
Mayor Dickens.
Yeah, so I mean, everything they said has been absolutely correct, especially what Lejla said. And as a practitioner on the ground, I have quite a few thoughts on this. And I've been working with Secretary Fudge of HUD, probably met with her 5 times in this past 4 or 5 months in DC and in Atlanta. Some of the thoughts are: 1, create a 40-year mortgage, something that allows us to pay less amount monthly so people can have more money than month, because a lot of people have more month than money. So, 40-year mortgage, I know some will probably balk at that because they say, oh, this is longer debt, but essentially a lot of things are about being able, the way that housing costs are escalating, you're going to build equity and you need to be able to pay for it to live in it a while. So create a 40-year mortgage or something similar. The LIHTC deals, the low income housing tax credits, they expire after 10 years. So it's almost, things need to last at least a generation. 10 years is a short amount of time to do all this. If you're at Invest Atlanta or Lejla's organization or ANDP or these things, you go out here and you work on a deal and you work on it. It takes you like 3 years to work on a deal, 2 years to construct it. It gets going. 10 years later, it's now market rate. So you're not even a generation. I mean, the kids started kindergarten and now they're a 9th grader or 10th grader, and you're now in flux as to are you going to be able to live there. So all these housing incentives need to last at least a generation. Some other things, some other thoughts are around investors, as was seen on the screen there. 30 to 40% of property that's been purchased in my city has been purchased by people that are outsiders. They're just buying it for profit. And communities are really about people, their families, schools, grocery stores, restaurants, churches, et cetera. It's about a community, not really just for gain financially. And so when you come at housing, which is a limited stock because limited amount of land, and you do it for profit, I think the federal government should have something to say about that, because I have something to say about it. So there should be limitations on how much banks can invest in communities. There should be caps on it. And, it's hard to do, but I think it's significant because there's so many regulations on banks and so much regulation on land. I would think that together there would be a nexus that we could operate around that says these large scale investors from New Jersey or Delaware or Vegas buying up property sight unseen in Atlanta, creating an artificial inflation is wrong. And I think, and I voiced that in DC. Yeah. I'll stop there because I got like 5 more.
Let's talk about then, not just outside investors, but there's another external factor here, and that is, of course, and I think Mayor Steele alluded to it when he talked about economic development, which we all love economic development. That's great. But as you know, if a Microsoft comes in, and I'm not picking on Microsoft, or a Google or Amazon or any tech firm that comes in, they're offering high-paying jobs to their folks. Their folks want to live in the city. So let's look at Grove Park.
Yeah.
We love Grove Park. There are legacy residents there. You told me when you were running for mayor, you said you would have a conversation with Microsoft. You wanted to make sure they understood that there were a lot of community engagement that needed to happen. Is that something that you feel that the city of Atlanta is going to do better in terms of this community engagement when these type of economic development projects come online, to ensure that, 1, they're not going to price out the folks who live there, and 2, that they are going to offer some jobs to folks in the community and job training, because promises have been made.
Yeah.
I mean, some folks still mad about the new stadium, which I think is understandable. Georgia State, and I'm gonna get all these emails, y'all. Georgia State, so where to begin with that? And is that something that the city can do, or do they need to pass legislation to ensure that when these big companies come in, that they know this it's not going to happen unless you do X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I have been, really vocal about my conversations with Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft. The day that they announced they were coming, they had a small group of 12 of us they brought in, and everybody was like, oh, this is great, 10,000 jobs, this campus here. And I said, it's great, but I also said, Brad, I don't want you to bring 150,000 theirs from the West Coast that can't afford to live off of $150,000 to Grove Park, 10,000 of them. Mm-hmm. You will upset the whole ecosystem of our city, our region, if you bring a bunch of 100,000 theirs that can't afford to live on the West Coast, and they move right next to grandmas and aunties that are making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, you will upset the ecosystem of Grove Park and beyond. And so the goal is to train up talent within the region to take those 10,000 jobs so that the ribbon cutting doesn't look like, you know, Brad and I cutting a ribbon. It looks like 2,500, 3,000 local Atlantans cutting that ribbon, going right into their $100,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 job, that they can still live in the communities they want to live in. And so there's a local hiring requirement that I like to have. It's just difficult. Microsoft didn't come in and ask for a dime from the city. Sure. They didn't ask for anything. I see our great school board member here, Cynthia Briscoe Brown. They didn't come in and ask for any incentives at all. They're wealthy. They are a nation state, as you were saying. They came in, they bought land, and they didn't need an incentive. They needed an incentive. I got some.
But they bought land from another entity that claimed they were going to build up the.
Right.
I went over there and I talked to them.
They claimed they were going to do some stuff.
Right.
Right. So here's the other thing, though. This is why I created a strike force just recently, an affordable housing strike force. I don't need another binder. Don't need no more research. We don't need another study group. We know what we're supposed to do. 8 years ago, what was 8? In 2014, you could have bought every vacant property in Grove Park for $12 million. And there were some decision makers that were at the table that did not forcefully find that $12 million. Now you can't get but maybe 2 pieces of vacant land for $12 million. This is about being forward thinking. And so that's why I'm establishing this, what we're calling a strike force. That's MARTA, APS, Atlanta Housing, Invest Atlanta, the Land Bank Authority, all of us working together, looking at a portfolio of all of this, you know, city and government owned land, and the cash that we have a housing opportunity bond that has a 92 million out of 100 million left. We just don't spend money fast enough. This is a piggy bank that people are accumulating versus an actionable tool. And so I guess I'm, you know, everybody that may not know all the details, but I guess I'm articulating that the market is moving faster than government and nonprofits and our slow decision making. And we have to be ahead of it. We have to be forceful about it and vocal about it. And so now when I communicate with Microsoft, they're training folks through training programs I created at TechBridge, through Europe, through other places, to train people to take these jobs, to have these jobs in the community, working with the schools, et cetera. So Microsoft is about to do their part, but we got to make sure they do it on the housing front, on the workforce development side. And there'll be a Google, Facebook, they're all coming. They love Atlanta. They love the talent that we have at the AUC and Georgia Tech, et cetera. But we don't want to get played. And the way that you don't get played is you walk into a room, you tell them we're not going to get played, but we want you here. So let's work together.
All right.
What you do.
Mayor Still, I know that you would love economic development to continue in Lawrenceville. You did say that you're all a bit smaller, but you all had a situation where you had families, households that were living in extended stay hotels. Some folks have been living there for 5 years. That's all they could afford. But then you all bought the property. First question, what happened to those households? Were you all able to help them find some affordable and better quality housing? As you mentioned too, that was an issue in your city?
Yeah, it was very important so that we take care of all our community. So we hired Impact 46 that created Lawrenceville Response Center. And they were able to, the 2 extended stays that we have purchased, they were able to get stable housing for 53% of the families. And they're still working with those families. Now, some didn't want any assistance. We assisted everybody. If they just wanted to move, we gave them relocation money. But it was really neat training up some of the, to see people learn how not to live week to week to week, but rather think of a career, think of a job, think of how to get the transportation, how to get there. So that was, there was one gentleman, for instance, he was paying $1,400 a month, had a family of 5. 2-bedroom, mini fridge, microwave, and he had lived there for 10 years. And he did it because he only wanted to write one check. So and then we had another gentleman that didn't even know when he was doing his budget, and he was so proud of his budget, and he brought it to Jen Young, our executive director, and they looked at it, and he didn't have rent and utilities in the budget because the nonprofits and churches had been subsidizing that. So with the extended stay industry, the industry, the way they look at their business plan is they want at least 50% of their revenue to come from churches and nonprofits. So that way they can keep the rates high, and we're going to give them what I call, blood money.
Are you all going to build on those properties?
We are building a lower density. One thing Lawrenceville doesn't have, which I know everybody else seems to have, but we don't have executive housing. So we're working with one of the developments, which is near Central Gwinnett High School. There's 96 townhomes and houses that will be coming in there that will be executive housing. Then the other site, really we're focused more on trying to find some medical and IT higher paying jobs because it's at the intersection of 316 and 20. So we're trying to find a way if we can assemble some land there to do that because we need the higher paying jobs.
What do you tell developers when they want to come in and build residential housing? What are the policies that you all have to let them know this is what we would like and this is what would be acceptable, given what you've just said about the crisis in your city?
Well, with the one of the biggest projects we did we call South Lawn, it was mainly on property that the city owned and the Board of Education owned. But when we brought in those developers, we did just what you said. I sat down with George Burkow and I said, got to make sure that they weren't going to take advantage of us because they were really big developers. But they were men of their word. They did what they said they were going to do. And we created at that time, we didn't even have the zoning for what they were doing. Now we do, a CMU. But we created specific zoning so we would have quality housing, and it would be a mix of, we had 400 multifamily, and then we had 200 that was either townhomes or detached. And so now it's a really interesting community, very diverse. And we've met with that community. Our council wanted to meet with them, and we got together and met with them. And so it's a whole new city.
Jim, and these next two questions were for you and Lejla, specifically because you're working with organizations, and you've heard what the elected officials have said, and you've talked about in terms of from federal to state to local what needs to happen. But what's missing through your lens in terms of what you all need more of in terms of public and private partnerships to help address this issue? What are you not hearing?
Yeah, it's interesting. And just piggybacking a little bit on the extended stay. So an extended stay hotel, having your family of 5 in a hotel room at $1,400 a month is not inexpensive housing. It's not affordable housing, but this is what we allow because we're not solving the problem. This is what I'm saying. It's a human, there's humanity behind this. And so for me, when I think about our circumstances at Focus Community Strategies, we have a property. We're trying to develop a 20-unit multifamily small apartment complex. And we are on the southeast side of the connector, and we are a Beltline neighborhood that is starting to turn. But this property, the value of this property, we do not have a mechanism between what it will cost us to develop this 20 units of housing that we want half those units to be affordable at 80% AMI and below. We've got a $2 million gap that we cannot get anybody to fund. So
how much?
$2 million gap. It's a $10 million.
The mayor's sitting right here.
Hence the story. So the reason is, At the end of the project, it has about a $5 million value. So the algorithm, the numbers, the financial stack doesn't add up. But I will tell you, in 4 years, 5 years, that property is going to be worth well over that because of the infrastructure that's coming. So we need mechanisms that will allow us, if this property were 1.5 miles from where it is, it'd be no problem. So if we were across the tracks into Grant Park, Chosewood, into other neighborhoods, we could get this development done. So we need some sort of leverage to be able to encourage investment in neighborhoods that allow us to develop the units we need. Now, I will say the other reality is if this were a 100-unit development, we could do it. We could do it with structures that we have created. But this is a small infill lot. It's a lot of the work we do, single family work and multifamily. So we need thinking that will allow us to go outside the box. That would be one thing. The other thing is, I will tell you, there are just a number of, and I'm speaking of Atlanta, there are a number of great affordable housing developers, nonprofits, ANDP, Atlanta Land Trust, Habitat for Humanity, SUMEC, Quest. There are a number of us, and we are fighting for just the smallest piece of the bucket for development, but we're the city, we're a treasure if you're trying to develop affordable housing. And I would say, I know we don't always compete with our bigger for-profit brothers and sisters out there, but we are one of the best sources of affordable housing, and we need a little bit bigger bucket to split amongst us. I'm sure that some would agree with me on that.
Yep.
And they tend to be long-term affordable.
They are long-term affordable. That's what we do. We love it.
You mentioned the other side of the tracks, and many of you know our beloved Maynard Jackson used to always talk about equity on the other side of the track. Before we get to Q&A from the audience, I want to get this question to Lejla in terms of, what you're seeing, what you're not hearing. Jim, I mentioned money, which funding is always important, but there is a respectability and a human aspect to this as well. I want to get your thoughts on, in terms of perception that people have about affordable housing, and can it be profitable for the outside, the external developer?
Unlike Atlanta, affordable housing discussions in Gwinnett County are relatively new, and the ones that we have had maybe starting 10 years ago, I have given so many speeches on it. I know many people would snooze off because I would try to incorporate affordable housing conversation into that of economic development. In Gwinnett County right now, more than half of the households are cost burdened. How does that translate into economic development? Well, the less discretionary income you have, the less you can invest in the local businesses. Mm-hmm. So, but a lot of it really has not been at the it hasn't been a high priority, unfortunately. And I do believe with the newer administration, this is really something they're heavily looking into. And they conducted a housing study, and they're putting a task force together to the chairwoman actually set aside a budget to put that task force together to start implementing some of these recommendations from the study. What we need, let me just kind of go back to the extended stays. When you featured actually our work a couple of years ago, when our extended stay study became, when we ran it and found there was no data set at all in Gwinnett County. What is the number of people who are precariously housed? Suburban counties often get overlooked because still a lot of the federal calculations and data tracking still focuses on urban cores. So even the homeless point in town count in Atlanta, you can go into a shelter, you can add, count 200 people relatively quickly. Whereas in Gwinnett County, we don't have those shelters. And in Gwinnett County, people who are living in extended stays, for example, they are not counted as homeless, even though throughout their tenure, they go in and out of actual homelessness. Mm-hmm. So that's why we did that study, to show the extent. 84% of the respondents in the city of Norcross said that they use that as a place of residence. And 20% of them have been there for 5 years and more. Adding the humanity component to it, for me, what was a turning point was when our work with the Lawrenceville Response Center at the offset of the pandemic was featured in the Atlanta Regional Commission. And they interviewed one of our clients. And they struggled to get her to schedule an interview because she was working 2 jobs, one at Amazon, one at Walmart. Remember those names. They have to do 2 of those jobs to make the rent. And she was actually in an extended stay with 4 grandchildren. And we were happy, that our program got recognition. But then 2 weeks later, I received a phone call that she passed away from a heart attack. And in an extended stay room with 4 of her grandchildren. So we have people living and dying literally in these extended stays. Right now, they're paying upwards to $3,000. We cannot vilify the charities who are putting them in these extended stays. It's not ideal, but this is a symptom of a very unhealthy housing market. And a lot needs to be done. And as a nonprofit, for example, what we do need is flexible funding. That's where the community foundation, they are $100,000. It really helped us to invest in some of the pre-development costs that we don't have grant money for. We don't get reimbursed with our grants if the project doesn't go through. So we are not allowed to take risks and study some of these sites. We look at 90 sites for development potential and affordability before we purchased one. So flexible capital stack, and I really think every city in the county, they should have an affordable housing ordinance, specifically for affordable housing development, where they expedite the permitting process, where they do automatically, if it has an affordable component, you can increase the density, you can shrink the square footage, anything to help us, because we already have a lot of regulatory burden on the federal side that we have to comply with. And now when we're trying to find the land and making those 2 fit together, and then any other foundation and their strings that might come with it, it's almost impossible. So any relief in that arena and flexible source of funding that we can add to our capital stack would go a long way.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Your Honor. Frank, we do have time for a few questions from the audience.
Questions? Come on down. I'll meet you. Mr. Joyner. Introduce yourself.
How y'all doing? My name is Bame Joyner, co-founder of a company called Atlanta Influences Everything. And I just saw Mr. Fernandez and Mayor Dickens in Austin, which I'm sure they probably already told you, discussing the same subject. So earlier when you said there was a $2 million gap, and then Rose Scott, as she would do, she's slick, so she pointed it back over there. But the more I've learned about the public sector and their money, they have money, but they have influence too. And Atlanta has influence. And when it comes to private sector brands that either their CSR efforts that they mostly come up with on their own, they haven't really asked anybody if that's what they want. They just kind of do their own thing. But if you were to turn the conversation back on them, using DEI efforts, and I'm a marketer, so forgive my ignorance, but if you were to commit to like Panasonic and say, all of the equipment in here is gonna be you, or whatever. And when we brand, when we talk about this development, your logo, because that's where I come from, marketing and branding, your logo will always be around. Now I know it's a slippery slope, like in just committing to one brand, but if you were like super serious about the 2 million, I kind of come from guerrilla. We find the money, we throw parties, we do events without a lot of support. So is there a way in which you could flip the conversation back on the private sector and have them feel, since they're committing to DEI, almost make this a DEI effort and get money from 2 to 3 brands to fill that $2 million gap?
Jim, you want to answer that?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm not a marketer, so I appreciate that. And my answer would be, yeah, maybe. And we have had dozens and dozens of meetings with different potential funders, private, public, on that. And I would say the conversations tend to move away from brand or marketing to, because we all want affordable housing. We know Atlanta wants this type of infill. We talk about it. And we've got a mechanism to work on a different type of development, and we haven't been able to bend it our direction. But I certainly would be glad to have the marketing and branding help.
Go ahead. So one of the things that I think he's also referring to is in the specific and in the general. So DEI is somewhere near real and a catchphrase for some companies, right? And it's almost bad to not have a DEI statement and still try to do business. So you kind of slap DEI on something and you say, got that, check it off. That way nobody comes at me for not knowing what I stand for, but you really don't stand for it as well as we want you to stand for it. So I think Mr. Joyner's point is more along the lines of how do the ground level, the things that we're talking about, actually gets elevated and actually train them on what real DEI would look like in Atlanta, what real community outreach would look like and feel like, and actually, what are the outcomes? So sometimes you hear, well, I don't want, a $10,000 table buy at our banquet to be your only expression of love for the community. Although nonprofits always are happy to get that $10,000, but it's really not enough. I've been a nonprofit executive, chief development officer, and my job was to go out there and ask for the $10,000 table buy, ask for the $25,000. But when this economy is huge, when a house can go from $245 or $275 in 2019 to now be $400,000, then your $10,000 is like a penny. Right. And so I think that there's a point to be made that he's making, which is about, we kind of spend our time really dealing with real people and real issues. And maybe when you're in a corporate tower, you're hearing it from the clouds and maybe from the tower level, but the ground level is saying, don't look at your portfolio of how you're going to spend, $10 million this year and you give this nonprofit 10, 10, 10. And you're like, whew, got everything checked off. You really got to see, like, are you really being impactful? Thus the need for a bigger brand conversation. Am I helpful in that, Joyner? Bang. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Joyner.
I've been saying a lot of folk became woke in 2020, but now they sleep. So I don't know what's happening.
Microsoft Village, brought to you by FCS. All right.
Another question.
Good morning, Cynthia Briscoe Brown, Atlanta Board of Education, Seat 8 at large. I want to start by thanking Mayor Dickens for not only the shout out this morning, but for establishing the Affordable Housing Strike Force, and specifically for including Atlanta Public Schools, giving us a seat at the table. That's a critical part of each of our neighborhoods, each of our communities, because we know that schools are the heart and soul of our neighborhoods and our communities. Unfortunately, that strike force didn't get started in quite enough time to stop the heartbreak of Forest Cove, which WABE has done such a good job of making the public aware of and spurring responses throughout the city. My question is, how can we facilitate and encourage both private developers, the nonprofit sector, and other entities to bring groups together like the strike force is doing, and specifically include issues around education, transportation, infrastructure, food deserts early in the conversation? Also, many of these entities, like our school systems, whether in Atlanta or elsewhere, have vacant land which could be used to solve some of these problems. How can we facilitate and encourage collaboration with these entities so that we can make best use of that land and also be included in those conversations very early in the process?
Yeah, thank you. Board member. Forest Cove, if you haven't heard of it, whether it was called Four Seasons or Forest Cove, is a heartbreak. It is literally, if you were to leave here right now and go there, you would shed a tear. You would. And I don't care how hardened of a person you are, you would see deplorable living conditions in the city of Atlanta. That area is the lowest income census tract in the whole state of Georgia. And Georgia got some pretty rough spots. And this area has been, it's not owned by the city, by the way. HUD owns it, the federal government owns it, and it's operated by a third party. And there's a school adjacent to it called Thomasville Heights, and there's other school land there, and there's the former Thomasville Heights projects that was there, and then there's other land that's owned, and there's a federal penitentiary. So this whole south side of the city has a lot of government-owned property, thus the need for a strike force to be able to say, well, why don't we redevelop this as a mixed income community with the grocery store, with the school, with all the proper amenities. But before we can do that, you got 211 families that are living in a horrible place. I'm cold up here on this stage. Y'all might be cold out there. The day I went to Forest Cove this year, it was 36 degrees and there were more broken windows and no heat that wasn't working. And that's in Atlanta. And so the only thing I thought to do was use whatever resources we had. I found $9.1 million, pulled it to move them. It's not my fault, but it is my problem. It's federal owned land, ain't mine. It's a third party operator, not a government, not a city entity. But to move the needle, to change these people's lives, we are taking each family and finding them. You need a 3-bedroom. We're looking all over Metro Atlanta for a 3-bedroom for that family, 4-bedroom for this family, 2-bedroom. So we're spending a lot of time on that, but it's way late in the game. This property has been deplorable for 8, 9, 10 years. And so I think that's where nonprofit, government, schools, corporations all have to look at these things together, as you were just communicating. Forest Cove being one example, whole Campbellton Road corridor in our city being another. Around, the good news still, around the quarry where Microsoft is going, we own a lot of land for MARTA. We got the Beltline inclusionary zoning. We did put a moratorium on development, so we're trying to manage that. But now we're about to start using the strike force that I just created to try to really get down to developing on this land. Mixed income. Now, mind you, we're at affordable housing conversation, but you do not want to go back to 100% concentration of poverty where you can't attract a Publix or a Kroger, where you can't attract any of the amenities. So we need everything from 100% AMI all the way down, and you need some market rate. We want to rebuild a whole sense of full community where people grow together, kind of like Centennial did, like Eastlake did. And so we're going to do that.
Thank you for that. Next question.
Got to have a
Hey y'all, my name is Victoria Hollis and I'm a brand new Atlanta resident. So the learning curve for me here is pretty steep, but I was also struck by the stats about investor purchases on property. And so it seems to me that we've got this institutional investor level that takes up a large part of the market, and that there is this nonprofit level as well that's doing what they can with the money that's available to create long-term affordable housing. What is the precedent for, or currently existing initiatives, or the opportunity for things that can support or incentivize residential investors, some of these long-term legacy residents who want to invest back in their neighborhoods and allowing them to have property ownership that leads to intergenerational wealth, but also is community based and coming from the ground up.
That's a good question.
I can handle that. Great question. So for me, home ownership, we have a home ownership program for first-time home buyers, and we serve clients who earn up to 80% of the area median income. So the presence of the institutional investors, it's really troubling to me. In Gwinnett County as well, some of the zip codes have seen up to 40% of the homes being acquired by these firms. So what we are doing is we really need, we can build a lot of housing. We need land. And like I mentioned, we looked at 90 lots before we settled on one, and we finally got it. We have 60 homes right now under construction for first-time home buyers, single family attached and detached, that we're building in throughout the county. Why is home ownership important? Because again, as a small nonprofit, we have only developed to date about 60 homes for home ownership, and that was done with the mentorship from the Atlanta Neighborhood Development Partnership. And now, obviously, we're doubling, that scale just in with two projects. But we track those families, and when you talk about long-term, sustainability, all of them have gone through the home ownership counseling programs. We haven't had a single foreclosure. And those families now have $7 million worth of equity that has been earned through just appreciation. 90% of our clients are families of color, BIPOC. So home ownership remains one of the most important ways to build that generational wealth and help reduce that wealth inequity that we're seeing just now grow with the home ownership prices growing. Those who are homeowners, we love that the values are going up because our equity is growing, right? But those who are not able to break into the housing market, they are being stuck as renters. And in Gwinnett County, rental rates have doubled since 2010. So we're really, there's no way right now, aside from what the nonprofits are building, for these first-time home buyers to get into the entry-level homes and start building that equity. We have proposed to the county just last year, Atlanta is on its third housing opportunity bond. I think we're ready for ours, and we showed how we can leverage that 12-to-1. And just for a $50 million bond, we can bring in additional $600 million for home ownership and rental units. So we're hoping, that was actually one of the recommendations from the housing study again, so we're hoping that gets looked into. But what I want to talk about is the importance. Yes, it's good to incentivize the private sector, but sometimes, the private sector is just not going to have a solution for a public problem. And to give you an example, we were working for families, moving them out of extended stays and into permanent housing. We were giving landlords $1,500 incentive. That was an authorized expense under the CARES Act funding. $1,500, and we marketed it to the apartments, management companies. Not a single one took us up on that offer. Almost all of the families who were relocated from extended stays were actually located in the housing owned by our nonprofit. So I think that just talks about the importance of supporting locally owned nonprofits and giving us resources so that we can scale our work, so we can serve some of the families that the private sector does not have a product for in the market right now.
Thank you, Lejla. Absolutely.
So, great question. So FCS, the neighborhood we serve, about 525 single-family homes. We have transitioned that neighborhood from 10% home ownership to 60%. A full half of that home ownership are low-income families that have their mortgage with us or Habitat. So we will acquire the property, rehab, or build a new house, depending on the condition of the property. And then we'll place the family, and we will flip and become the bank and provide the mortgage. So these are all families that are, the low-income families are all below 80% AMI. When you put the Habitats partnership, which is super important to what we do in the neighborhood with ours, we're serving home ownership to families that are 30 to 80% AMI. So it can be done. And so those families get the benefit of being in a Beltline neighborhood in Atlanta and watching their properties appreciate. The other thing that we did intentionally is when we started in the neighborhood, our first sets of houses were for children of legacy residents. So they can come back into neighborhood where they grew up and participate in the sort of rebirth of the neighborhood. We think that still, with all the struggles we talk about around affordable housing, home ownership, there's a couple ways you can build wealth in the US, right? You can do stock market, you can build a business and sell it, or just build up that business, or you can own a home. And it is still, home ownership is still, from my perspective, one of the best ways to produce wealth that works generationally. And so a great question. And in this need for units, and we're producing rental for a lot of that, the importance of producing home ownership opportunities for wealth creation, specifically for our BIPOC community, is super important.
Thank you. I know we could spend another hour or two talking about this, but the conversation doesn't have to end here. We at WABE, we love the fact that we can be the convener of these conversations. You can start by listening to Closer Look every day at 1 p.m. and listen to our WABE wonderful journalists who are covering these issues. But beyond that, you have the folks up here who you hold accountable and who you want to work with. So by all means, it takes a holistic approach. We established that when this conversation began. So let's not stop it here. Let's keep it going. Lejla Prljaca, Jim Wehner, Mayor David Steele, Mayor Andre Dickens, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Rose.